There is a sound a ship makes when the hull finally gives way to the sea. It is not a crash. It is a groan. Low and final. Like the ocean has been waiting. That is the sound I heard in my own chest when my daughter said, "Stop the drama, Dad," while her mother lay dying 6 feet from a machine that was doing her breathing for her. I spent 40 years building vessels that could survive hurricanes. My daughter spent 2 years drilling holes in mine. But the thing about a shipbuilder is this: we know exactly where to place the charges when it is time to sink a wreck. Before I tell you how I detonated every bridge she had left, let me tell you where you are watching from and what the weather looks like where you sit right now. Like and subscribe to follow this journey. Note: this is a fictional story with dramatized elements for deeper, meaningful impact. The ventilator hissed in a rhythm I could not stop counting. 3 seconds in. 2 seconds out. A mechanical tide filling lungs that should have been breathing on their own. I sat in the corner of the ICU at Addison Gilbert Hospital in Gloucester, Massachusetts, my hands resting on my knees like dead weight. The fluorescent light above me buzzed with the kind of low-frequency hum that reminded me of a hull vibrating under stress, that tremor you feel in your boots right before the rivets start to pop. My name is Russell Kane. I am 67 years old. I spent 4 decades in the shipyards of Cape Ann, reading the language of wood grain and steel plate, knowing by touch alone whether a vessel would hold or fold when the Atlantic came calling. I built trawlers that fished the Grand Banks in February. I built research vessels that broke ice off Newfoundland. I built my reputation one clean weld at a time, and I thought I had built my family the same way. I was wrong. At 9:47 that evening, Deborah was lying beneath a thin blue hospital sheet. Her face the color of old sailcloth, her skull held together by the work of a neurosurgical team that had spent 4 hours reassembling what Route 128 had shattered. My wife of 41 years. A retired Navy nurse who once stitched a sailor's leg back together during a storm so violent the ship's chaplain was praying out loud. Now she could not open her eyes. The call from the state police had come at 3:15 that afternoon. I was in my workshop sanding the gunwale of a restoration project when the phone rang. The officer's voice was flat, professional, stripped of anything that might prepare a man for the end of his known world. There has been an accident on Route 128 near the Essex interchange. A silver Honda Accord. Single vehicle. Your wife is being airlifted to Addison Gilbert. I remember the air leaving my body like a ship being scuttled. I remember driving to the hospital in a fog so thick I do not recall a single traffic light between my driveway and the emergency entrance. I remember the smell of the trauma bay, copper and iodine, and something burnt that I later realized was the scent of cauterized flesh. But most of all, I remember passing the accident site on the way. I slowed without meaning to. The old instincts of a man who has spent his life assessing structural failures, kicking in against his will. The guardrail was peeled back like tin foil. The skid marks were wrong. Or rather, they were absent. No rubber on the pavement. No evidence of braking whatsoever. The car had simply gone off the road at full speed on a curve that Deborah had driven 1,000 times. A ship does not sink without a reason. Neither does a car leave a highway without a mechanical explanation. The absence of skid marks told me something that my heart was not ready to hear. But my hands already knew. Something had failed, or something had been made to fail. Dr. Anderson, the neurosurgeon, emerged from the operating theater at 8:30, with blood on his scrubs and exhaustion carved into the lines around his eyes. He told me Deborah had a massive subdural hematoma. He told me the surgery was successful, but she remained in a coma. He told me the next 72 hours were critical. Then he told me about the transfer. There is a specialized neuro-rehabilitation center in Boston, he said. She needs to be there within 48 hours for the best chance at a full recovery. The deposit is $18,000. $18,000. A number I would have written without blinking 6 months ago. I nodded. Of course. Whatever she needs. I reached into my jacket pocket for my wallet, pulling out the credit card I had carried for 22 years. The card that had paid for our roof replacement our anniversary trips to Maine, and the down payment on Cassandra's first apartment. The nurse ran it through the machine. The tiny screen flickered, and then displayed a single word that split my life into before and after. Declined. I smiled the way you smile when you are sure a machine has made an error. I pulled out my backup card, the one linked to our home equity line. Ran it through. Declined. The nurse looked at me with a softness in her eyes that told me she had seen this moment before. I stared at the little screen, my reflection warped in the plastic surface, and felt the first structural crack run through the keel of everything I thought I knew. That is impossible, I told her. There is over $380,000 in those accounts combined. I built those numbers over 40 years, but the machine did not care about 40 years. The machine only knew what the numbers said right now, and right now, the numbers said I was a man with nothing, standing in a hospital where his wife was dying, holding two pieces of plastic that were worth less than the ink printed on them. I excused myself and walked to the hallway, my boots heavy on the linoleum. I pulled out my phone and opened the banking application, my thumb trembling against the glass. The little loading circle spun like water circling a drain. When the screen finally loaded, I saw a number that made my vision blur. $4,200. That was all that remained of a lifetime of labor. $4,200. In an account that should have held $380,000. I scrolled down to the transaction history. The transfers were methodical, clinical, spread across 24 months, like a slow leak below the waterline, and every single one of them flowed into the same destination, Kane Digital Ventures, LLC. My daughter's company. I leaned against the cold hospital wall and felt the groan of the hull giving way. The ocean had been patient, but it had finally come through. When a ship takes water below the waterline, the crew does not always know. The sea fills the bilge in silence, rising inch by inch in the dark spaces no one thinks to check. By the time the vessel lists, the damage is already terminal. I stood in that hospital hallway at 2 in the morning, staring at the blue glow of my phone screen, and realized I had been listing for 2 years without knowing it. Kane Digital Ventures, LLC, my daughter's company. The name sat on the transaction history, like a brand burned into the side of a stolen hull. I scrolled through the entries, my thumb moving with the careful precision of a man reading a damage report he already knows will condemn the vessel. The withdrawals were not random. They were architectural. 15,000 here, 22,000 there. A slow, methodical extraction that never once triggered the threshold alerts I thought I had set. I tried to steady my breathing. The hallway was empty save for the distant squeak of a nurse's shoes on linoleum and the ever-present hum of machines keeping people alive behind closed doors. I pulled up the account settings and felt my stomach turn to ballast stone. The alert email had been changed. 23 months ago, someone had replaced my personal email address with an address I had never seen. r.cane, financials@gmail.com. Every notification, every transfer confirmation, every security alert for nearly 2 years had been flowing into a digital void that I did not control. I had been sailing blind while someone else read my charts. I called the bank's emergency fraud line. The hold music was a cruel joke. A cheerful melody piped into the ear of a man watching his life's work dissolve into numbers on a screen. When the representative finally answered, I identified myself and explained the situation. She transferred me to a senior fraud investigator named Patricia Holden, whose voice carried the measured cadence of someone accustomed to delivering catastrophic news. Mr. Kane, she said after pulling up my file. I see a durable power of attorney was submitted to our branch 23 months ago. It authorized full access and transfer privileges to a secondary party. The document was notarized and filed in person. I leaned against the wall, the plaster cold through my shirt. I have never signed a power of attorney, I told her. Not for anyone. Not ever. A pause. The kind of pause that confirms what you already suspect, but are not yet willing to say out loud. The signature on file matches your known samples closely, Mr. Kane. But given what you are describing, we will flag this for a full forensic review. She told me it would take 72 hours to freeze the remaining accounts and begin the trace. 72 hours. My wife might not have 72 hours. And the person who had done this to us shared our blood. I asked Patricia one more question. The name on the power of attorney. The secondary party authorized to access my accounts. She read it back to me in that same clinical tone. Cassandra Elaine Kane. Date of birth, March 14th, 1988. Relationship to account holder, daughter. I closed my eyes and pressed my forehead against the cold hospital wall. There it was. Not a hacker. Not an identity thief, hiding behind a screen in some foreign country. My own daughter. The girl I taught to tie a bowline at age 6. The girl who used to sit on my workbench and hand me brass screws while I explained the difference between a Carvel hull and a clinker build. She had taken my name, my money, and apparently my signature, and she had done it with the patience of dry rot eating through a ship's ribs. I do not know how long I stood there. Time becomes irrelevant when the structure of your life is being condemned in real time. Eventually, I became aware of Nurse Callahan approaching, a woman in her 50s with short gray hair, and the kind of weary compassion that comes from decades of night shifts in critical care. She touched my arm gently. Mr. Kane, are you all right? You have been standing here a long time. I looked at her and realized my face must have shown something terrible, because she guided me to a plastic chair without another word and brought me a cup of water and a paper cone that felt like it might collapse in my hand. I drank it without tasting it. The numbers kept cycling through my mind. $380,000. 40 years of 16-hour days in the shipyard. 40 years of turning down vacations because the next contract was always more important than the present moment. 40 years of telling Deborah, next year we will go to Italy. Next year we will fix the porch. Next year we will finally rest. And now that next year had arrived, and it was empty. A hole stripped of everything that made it seaworthy. I opened the app again and looked at the investment portfolio. Empty. The mutual funds we had built since Cassandra was in elementary school. Gone. The bonds I purchased after every major contract. Dissolved. The emergency fund Deborah insisted we keep liquid for exactly this kind of moment. Drained to the last cent. Total remaining assets across all accounts. $4,200.14. That number will haunt me until the day I die. It is the price of trust given to the wrong hands. It is the exact weight of a father's blindness measured in decimal points. I looked back at the ICU doors where Deborah lay connected to machines that were costing money I no longer had. Somewhere in Boston, my daughter was sleeping in a bed I now knew I had paid for, dreaming whatever dreams a person dreams when they have spent 2 years cannibalizing their parents' future and gotten away with it. But here is what Cassandra did not account for. A shipbuilder does not panic when he finds a leak. He does not abandon the vessel. He identifies the breach, calculates the rate of flooding, and then he goes to work. Methodically. Precisely. With 40 years of knowledge about exactly how structures fail and exactly how to make them hold. I put my phone in my pocket, wiped my face with the back of my hand, and walked back toward the ICU. I had a deposit to figure out. I had a wife to save. And I had a daughter to dismantle. The ocean may have been patient, but so was I. I have seen predators surface in Gloucester Harbor. The way a great white breaks the waterline is not dramatic the way films would have you believe. It is quiet. A dark fin cutting through the gray chop with the kind of calm that only belongs to something that knows it is at the top of the food chain. That is exactly how Cassandra entered the ICU waiting area the following morning. Silent. Composed. Utterly certain of her position in the hierarchy. It was 9:15 when I heard the click of her heels against the linoleum. A sharp, metronomic sound that reminded me of a rivet gun being cocked. I had not slept. I had spent the remaining hours of the night in a plastic chair beside Deborah's bed, watching the monitors trace the electrical signature of a life that was still fighting to exist. My eyes were raw, my shirt wrinkled, and my hands carried the stale smell of hospital coffee that I had been drinking without tasting since midnight. Cassandra did not come to Deborah's room first. She came to the waiting area and paused at the glass partition to check her reflection. I watched her adjust the collar of a charcoal cashmere coat that probably cost more than my monthly pension. She carried a designer coffee in one hand, the steam curling up into the sterile air and mixing with a scent of roasted beans and bergamot that had no business existing in a building where people were fighting to breathe. She was 38 years old. The founder and CEO of Kane Digital Ventures, a fintech startup she claimed she had built from nothing. I now knew exactly what nothing meant. It meant my retirement. It meant Deborah's safety net. It meant 4 decades of sawdust and sweat translated into a Boston penthouse and a white Tesla. When she finally turned toward me, she offered a hug that felt less like an embrace and more like a contractual obligation. Her arms barely touched my shoulders before she pulled back, smoothing invisible wrinkles from her coat. "God, Dad, this lighting is criminal," she said, scanning the room with an expression of mild distaste. "How long have you been here? You look terrible. Your mother is in a coma, Cassandra." I replied, my voice carrying the low, flat tone of a man holding something volatile beneath a very thin surface. "She has been in surgery for 4 hours yesterday. She cannot breathe on her own." Cassandra sighed. It was the same sigh she had given me on the phone the night before. A sound that carried no weight of concern, only the inconvenience of being reminded that other people's emergencies existed. I pulled her away from the nurse's station, guiding her toward a quiet alcove near the elevators where the vending machines hummed their low electrical drone. I leaned in close enough to smell her perfume, something expensive and floral, that clashed with the antiseptic air like oil on water. "I checked the accounts this morning," I said. My voice was barely above a whisper, but each word was placed with the precision of a man setting the final frame on a ship's skeleton. "Every dollar is gone, Cassandra. 380,000. It all went to Kane Digital Ventures. I need that money back. Your mother needs that money right now. 18,000 for the transfer to Boston. Today." I watched her eyes. I have read The Grain of White Oak for 40 years, looking for the hidden flaws that would split under pressure. I have examined steel plates for microscopic fractures invisible to the untrained eye. I know what deception looks like at the molecular level. And what I saw in my daughter's face was not guilt. It was not shame. It was the cold, practiced stillness of someone who had already prepared for this conversation and decided it was beneath her. "Not my problem, Dad." 3 words delivered with the clinical efficiency of a scalpel making a clean cut. "I told you on the phone. I have overhead. I have payroll. I have a Series B funding round closing next week. Whatever happened with your finances is not my responsibility. Maybe you should have paid more attention to your accounts instead of spending every weekend in that workshop." The air between us turned to something solid. I noticed that she had referenced the $18,000 deposit amount before I ever specified it. She already knew. She was monitoring the hospital billing the same way she had monitored my bank accounts. Through the cracks she had engineered with that forged power of attorney. I stood there absorbing the blow the way a hull absorbs a rogue wave. You do not buckle. You do not list. You let the water wash over the deck, and you wait for the equilibrium to return. Cassandra checked a gold watch on her wrist, the one Deborah and I had given her for her 35th birthday. She sighed again. "I have a board meeting in an hour. Do not call me about this again. If Mom is meant to wake up, she will. We should wait and see before throwing good money after bad. Call me if anything permanent happens." Permanent. As if my wife's potential death was merely a scheduling milestone. As if the only version of this situation worth her attention was the one that ended in a funeral and a probate hearing. She turned on her heel and started toward the elevators, her heels resuming their metronomic click against the floor. But as she shifted her designer tote bag from one shoulder to the other, the flap fell open for just a moment. I saw it clearly. A blue legal folder with bold text along the tab. Petition for conservatorship. Russell Emmett Kane. She was not waiting for her mother to die. She was preparing to bury me alive in a state-run facility while I was still breathing. The folder disappeared as the bag settled back against her hip, but the image was seared into my retinas like a flash burn from a welding arc. I stood in that alcove and watched through the window as a white Tesla pulled out of the visitor lot. A car I had unknowingly purchased with my own stolen labor. I watched until the taillights disappeared around the corner of the building. And then I let out a breath I had been holding since she said, "Not my problem." There is a moment in every shipbuilder's career when he looks at a vessel he has been asked to repair and realizes the rot has gone too deep. The frames are compromised. The planking is paper thin. The keel itself has been eaten hollow. In that moment, you stop being a restorer and you become something else entirely. "I am done being a passenger on my own ship," I said to the empty hallway. The vending machine hummed its indifferent reply. I pulled out my phone and called the only man I trusted to hand me the tools I needed for what came next. In 40 years on the water, I have learned that the most important piece of equipment on any vessel is not the engine or the rudder or even the hull itself. It is the anchor, not because it moves you forward, but because it holds you steady when the current is trying to drag you onto the rocks. Edgar Whitmore has been my anchor for 45 years. And when he walked into the hospital cafeteria at 6:30 that morning, carrying a thermos of black coffee and a heavy, unmarked envelope, I felt the drag on my keel ease for the first time since the state police had called. Edgar is 70 years old. He retired from his boat repair yard on Rocky Neck 3 years ago, but his hands still carry the permanent calluses of a man who spent half a century pulling waterlogged vessels onto dry dock and bringing them back to life. He is built like a mooring post, short and thick, and impossible to move once he has planted himself. His handshake could crack a lobster claw, and his eyes hold the kind of clarity that only comes from decades of looking at broken things and deciding whether they are worth saving. He did not say hello. He did not ask me how I was doing. He set the thermos on the cafeteria table between us, poured me a cup of coffee that smelled like tar and tasted like salvation. And then he pushed the envelope across the Formica surface with 2 fingers. "That is not a loan, Russell," he said, his voice carrying the low gravel of a man who smokes a pipe on his porch every evening and has never once apologized for it. "That is a war chest. Go pay that nurse whatever she needs so they do not move Deborah an inch until you are ready." I opened the envelope and looked inside. $25,000 in banded hundreds. It was heavier than it should have been. It carried the weight of a second chance, of a friendship that had survived 4 decades of New England winters and never once asked for anything in return. I tried to push it back. I told him it was his emergency fund, his floor-safe money, the cash he kept for the kind of rainy day that comes with living on a coastline where nor'easters can take your roof in November. Edgar fixed me with a look that could strip varnish. "Stop it. Use it. Then start thinking like the man I know you are, instead of the victim they are trying to turn you into." He leaned forward, his elbows on the table, and dropped his voice to a register that barely rose above the hum of the cafeteria refrigerators. "You have spent 40 years reading the grain of the wood, Russell. You can tell white oak from red oak by running your thumb across the end grain in the dark. You can hear a delamination in marine plywood from 10 feet away. Tell me you did not see the rot in your own keel." I looked at him. I wanted to defend myself. I wanted to say that a daughter is not a ship, that you cannot inspect love the same way you inspect a hull. But the words would not come because he was right. The signs had been there. The increasing distance, the phone calls that always seemed rushed, the way Cassandra's eyes would flick toward my workshop whenever she visited, not with curiosity but with calculation. I had seen it all and called it nothing, because calling it something would have meant my family was taking water. I saw it. I admitted. I just did not want to read the survey report. Edgar nodded. No judgment in his face. Only the pragmatic sympathy of a man who understood that denial is not stupidity. It is love wearing a blindfold. Then take the blindfold off now, he said. And listen to me, because what I am about to tell you is going to make the money look like a parking ticket. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone, scrolling to a photograph he had taken 3 weeks earlier. It showed a black SUV parked in my driveway at what appeared to be late evening, the shadows long across the gravel. A man was visible at my side door, his body half turned toward the camera. Even in the dim light, I recognized him. Derek Merritt, my son-in-law. The man who had married Cassandra 4 years ago in a ceremony I had paid for on the cliffs of Rockport. The man who always shook my hand a little too firmly and complimented my workshop a little too enthusiastically. I was driving past your place 3 weeks ago on my way back from the chandlery, Edgar said. I saw his car in your driveway at 9 o'clock at night. Deborah was at her book club. You were on that job in Newburyport. He was at your side door with what looked like a lockpick set. I thought it was strange, but I did not want to start a war without proof. 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks before Deborah's brakes stopped existing on Route 128. It was not a burglary, I said, the pieces falling into place with the horrible mechanical precision of a bilge pump cycling. He was planting something, or taking something, or both. Edgar nodded slowly. That is what I figured when you called me tonight. This was not a spur-of-the-moment decision, Russell. This was planned, charted, like a course plotted months in advance. I sat there, letting the weight of it settle into my frame. My daughter had not just stolen my money on impulse. She had deployed her husband as an advance team. The surveillance had not started with the power of attorney. It had started with a man at my door in the dark, rifling through the structural documents of my life while I worked 60 miles away. They had been inside my house, inside my files, inside the walls of my life like termites eating the framing from the inside out. Edgar watched me process it, his old shipwright's eyes patient and steady. You going to fall apart on me? He asked, not unkindly. No, I said. And I meant it the way a keel means it when it holds firm in a following sea. I am going home. Good. Edgar stood up and clapped a hand on my shoulder that felt like an oak knee being set into a frame. You go home and you inspect every inch of that house the way you would inspect a vessel someone is trying to sell you for scrap. Every drawer, every file, every floorboard. Document everything. Photograph everything. And Russell. He paused at the cafeteria door, silhouetted against the gray morning light. Do not call her. Do not warn her. A shark does not know it is being hunted until the gaff is already through its jaw. I watched him leave, the weight of his envelope pressing against my ribs like a chest plate. I finished my coffee, paid the $18,000 deposit with Edgar's cash, and walked out of the hospital into a Gloucester morning that smelled like salt and diesel and the cold promise of a reckoning. I was going home to conduct the most important dry dock inspection of my life. A dry dock is where you bring a vessel when you need to see what the ocean has been hiding. You drain the water away, expose the bottom to daylight, and then you look at every inch of what used to be submerged. You look for the fouling, the corrosion, the places where something has been eating through the barrier coat while you sailed along thinking you were safe. I drove home from the hospital in the gray Gloucester morning and pulled into my driveway knowing that what I was about to find beneath the waterline of my own life would be worse than anything I had seen in 40 years of shipyard work. The front porch light was dead. Not burned out. Disconnected. I noticed it the moment I stepped out of my truck. The fixture hung slightly crooked, the wire capped off with a twist nut that was not my handiwork. Someone had killed the light deliberately, creating a blind spot in the one area covered by my exterior security camera. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The house did not smell like Deborah. It should have smelled like the lavender sachets she kept in every drawer and the salt air that crept through the window screens even in October. Instead, it smelled of stale air and a cloying, expensive perfume that I recognized immediately as Cassandra's signature scent. She had been here recently, and she had stayed long enough for the walls to absorb her presence. I moved through the foyer with the clinical detachment of a surveyor, entering a vessel that has been reported as compromised. My eyes tracked the details. A stack of mail on the hallway table shifted 2 inches to the right. The dust on my antique barometer had been disturbed by fingers smaller than mine. The closet door in the study was not fully latched, something I would never have left undone. My first stop was the security system. I pulled up the app on my phone and felt my jaw tighten. The last 48 hours of footage had been remotely deleted. The access log showed the system had been disabled from an IP address I traced in under 30 seconds. It belonged to the registered network of Kane Digital Ventures LLC, Office Suite 412, Innovation Row, Boston. She had not just stolen my money. She had blinded my eyes while she did it. Every camera in this house had been dark while Derek Merritt walked through my rooms with a lockpick and a shopping list. I went to my home office. The room where I kept 40 years of project files, tax returns, insurance documents, and the careful paper architecture of a life built one contract at a time. I headed straight for the lateral file cabinet behind my shelf of maritime engineering references. Behind a false panel I had installed when we moved in 30 years ago, a space only Deborah knew about, I found what should not have been there. A manila folder containing the closing documents for a home equity line of credit in the amount of $130,000, taken against the full value of our home. The signature at the bottom was a near-perfect mimicry of my own hand, paired with a notary stamp from a name I had never heard before. Victor Hale. Licensed Notary Public, Commonwealth of Massachusetts. $130,000. Borrowed against the roof over our heads by someone who had practiced my signature until the forgery was indistinguishable from the real thing. I held the paper up to the desk lamp and studied the pen strokes. They were close, dangerously close. But a man who has spent 4 decades reading the micrograin of wood knows that no two trees grow exactly alike. The downstroke on the R was too confident. My hand has carried a faint tremor since I turned 63. A minor palsy from decades of vibration exposure in the shipyard. Whoever signed this document had steady hands. Young hands. I set the HELOC papers aside and continued the excavation. Deeper in the cabinet, behind a row of old project binders, I found a glossy brochure for a facility called Granite Shores Memory Care. The cover showed a sterile white building surrounded by manicured grounds that looked more like a minimum security prison than a retirement community. Tucked inside was a draft inquiry letter requesting immediate availability for 2 residents under involuntary conservatorship. The letter was typed on Kane Digital Ventures letterhead. 2 residents. Not 1. She was planning to put us both in that place. Lock us behind coded doors and strip us of every legal right while she liquidated our home, our possessions, and 4 decades of memories into startup capital. My hands remained steady. A shipwright does not shake when he finds rot. He simply marks the location and continues the survey. I moved to the next folder, the one labeled in Deborah's careful handwriting. Insurance documents. Primary. Inside I found our life insurance policy. $750,000 of coverage on Deborah, taken out 20 years ago when we refinanced the house. But the beneficiary page had been altered. The original document listed me as the sole beneficiary with Cassandra as the secondary contingent. What I was looking at now showed Cassandra Elaine Kane as the primary and only recipient. The change of beneficiary form was dated 11 months ago. The notary stamp belonged to the same Victor Hale. $750,000. That was the dollar amount my daughter had placed on her mother's life. Add the secondary policy I found beneath it. Another $450,000 taken out 6 months ago without either of our knowledge, and the total value of Deborah's death exceeded $1.2 million. My stomach turned to cold iron, but I kept going. The last thing I found was not a document. It was a printout from the vehicle diagnostic portal for Deborah's Honda Accord, the car that was now a compressed sculpture of metal in a police impound lot. The log showed the vehicle's onboard computer system, specifically the anti-lock braking system module. 3 weeks before the crash, on the same night Edgar had photographed Derek at my door, the ABS firmware had received an over-the-air update from an unverified source. The system had been patched, modified, compromised. I stared at that printout and felt the final piece of the survey fall into place with a click that echoed through my chest like a hull bolt seating into a frame. This was not a financial crime. This was not a daughter stealing from her parents out of greed or desperation. This was an assassination attempt executed through software. A digital hand, reaching into the mechanical heart of my wife's vehicle and ripping out the one system designed to keep her alive on a wet October road. Cassandra had not just drilled holes in my ship. She had removed the bilge pumps and waited for the storm. I set the printout on my desk, squared its edges with the rest of the evidence, and reached for my phone. The number I needed was not Edgar's this time. It was a number that would bring the kind of weight that even a fintech CEO could not hack her way out of. When a ship goes down, the investigators do not start with theories. They start with the black box. They recover the data recorder from the wreckage, and they let the numbers tell the story that survivors cannot. Emotion lies. Memory distorts. But a ledger, a transaction log, a digital timestamp, these things carry the cold, indifferent truth of what actually happened and in what order. I sat at my desk that night with the lamp burning a yellow circle on the wood and began to perform an autopsy on my own financial life, following the blood trail of my savings into the cold machinery of my daughter's ambition. I opened my laptop and logged into every account I could still access. The bank's fraud team had provided me with a complete transaction history, going back 24 months. A spreadsheet of extraction that read like the engineering schematic of a purpose-built parasitic system. Cassandra had not stolen from us the way a burglar steals, in one violent act, and then vanishes. She had installed herself into our financial architecture like a bilge pump running in reverse, draining us one systematic transfer at a time while we slept above deck. The first major hemorrhage was dated 14 months ago, $120,000 wired to a real estate escrow account in Boston. I traced the property records online and found it within minutes. A 2-bedroom penthouse condominium in the Seaport District with floor-to-ceiling harbor views. I pulled up her company's social media page and there it was. A photograph of Cassandra, standing in a pristine white kitchen with marble countertops and brass fixtures, raising a glass of champagne. The caption read, "New chapter, new view. Self-made success. Self-made. Built on the bones of her father's 4 decades in the shipyard." The second wound was $85,000 paid in a single lump sum to a luxury auto dealership in Brookline. The white Tesla I had watched pull out of the hospital parking lot that morning. She had driven to her dying mother's bedside in a vehicle purchased with money stolen from the woman on the ventilator. I traced the smaller transfers next, the ones that told me this was not a solo operation. Every month, for the past 18 months, a payment of $4,500 had been routed from my stolen home equity line to an account in Derek Merritt's name. The payments were labeled consulting fees, but when I cross-referenced the dates with Derek's known activities, a pattern emerged that turned my blood to something cold and tidal. Edgar had mentioned it on the phone weeks ago as passing gossip. Derek had gotten into cryptocurrency trading, had been spending nights at his computer, had seemed agitated at the last neighborhood gathering. What Edgar had not known was that Derek was not trading. He was hemorrhaging. The consulting fees from my equity line were being immediately forwarded to platforms I recognized from news reports as high-risk, decentralized exchanges. Derek Merritt had a gambling addiction dressed in a Silicon Valley costume, and my daughter was feeding it with my retirement to keep him compliant and silent about the rot they were building together. I totaled the figures on a legal pad, my handwriting steady and precise. $380,000 from the savings and investment accounts, $130,000 from the home equity line, $85,000 for the vehicle, $120,000 for the penthouse, $54,000 in consulting fees over 12 months. The number that stared back at me from the yellow page was $510,000. $500,000. That is what 40 years of honest labor is worth, when it is fed through the digestive system of a child who sees her parents not as people, but as a resource to be mined until the vein runs dry. But the money was not what made my hands grip the edge of the desk until my knuckles went white. It was what I found next. I had accessed Cassandra's company server through a shared cloud folder she had set up years ago for family photos. She had never revoked my access. An oversight born of the same arrogance that made her think I was too analog to notice the digital theft. In a subfolder, buried 3 levels deep, mislabeled as Q3, marketing assets, I found a browser history export that had been accidentally synced. The search terms made the air in my office feel like the inside of a compression chamber. Remote vehicle, ABS, module vulnerability, OTA, firmware exploit consumer vehicles, Honda Accord. 2021. Telematics access, how to disable ABS system remotely without triggering dashboard warning. I read each entry with the cold focus of a man examining the rivet pattern on a hull that has been deliberately weakened. These searches were dated 6 weeks before the crash. 6 weeks of research. 6 weeks of planning how to turn my wife's daily commute into a death sentence delivered at highway speed on a curve that would leave no skid marks and no survivors. I dug further. In the same folder, I found an email draft never sent but saved, addressed to a freelance automotive software consultant. The subject line read, "Custom firmware patch. Private project. NDA required." The body of the email described a modification to the ABS control module of a specific Honda Accord model year, requesting that the patch be delivered via a spoofed over-the-air update that would appear legitimate to the vehicle's onboard diagnostics. She had commissioned the weapon, built it to specification, and then deployed it 3 weeks before the crash, through the same digital infrastructure her company used to process financial transactions. I scrolled further and found one more document that sealed the architecture of her plan. An email sent to a physician named Dr. Richard Foss at a geriatric assessment clinic in Cambridge. The subject line read, "Confidential inquiry. Cognitive evaluation for elderly parent." In it, Cassandra described my behavior in terms designed to suggest early onset dementia. She referenced forgotten appointments that had never existed, repeated questions I had never asked, and confusion about finances that she herself had engineered by draining my accounts. She was building the case for incompetence. If the car crash did not kill Deborah, and if the financial drain did not break me, then the final phase was to have me declared unfit. A forged medical assessment. A conservatorship granted by a sympathetic judge. 2 old people locked in Granite Shores while their daughter sold the house, collected the insurance, and toasted her own brilliance from a Harbor View penthouse paid for with blood money. I closed the laptop. The screen went dark, and for a moment I sat in the glow of just the desk lamp, listening to the distant sound of the ocean through the window. The evidence was complete. The survey was finished. Every plank, every frame, every fastening had been examined, and the verdict was total condemnation. This vessel could not be repaired. It could only be scuttled with precision, documented with evidence, and sunk in a controlled demolition that would leave no doubt about who had drilled the holes. I picked up my phone and dialed Catherine Mercer's emergency line. It was time to bring in the Coast Guard. There is a rule in maritime emergencies that every sailor learns before he ever touches a wheel. When the hull is compromised beyond your ability to repair at sea, you do not waste time with buckets and prayers. You call the Coast Guard. You let the professionals bring their cutters and their jurisdiction and their authority to bear on the situation while you focus on keeping the vessel afloat long enough for them to arrive. I drove to Boston the following morning with my briefcase on the passenger seat, knowing that what I carried inside those leather walls was enough to sink a ship that had been built entirely on stolen timber. Catherine Mercer's office occupied the 14th floor of a glass tower on Federal Street, the kind of building where the elevators smell like money and the carpets swallow sound. I had found her name through Edgar, who had used her services 3 years ago during a property dispute with a marina developer. He described her in 2 words: a weapon. She was 43 years old with a sharp, dark bob that framed a face built for cross-examination. Her handshake was brief and firm, the grip of a woman who had spent 2 decades in courtrooms where hesitation was the first sign of blood in the water. She did not offer me coffee or small talk. She simply said, "Show me," and pointed to the conference table. I spread the evidence across the mahogany surface, the way I would lay out the survey findings for a condemned vessel. The forged power of attorney. The HELOC documents with Victor Hale's notary stamp. The beneficiary change forms on the life insurance policies. The vehicle diagnostic printout showing the ABS firmware modification. The browser history exports. The email to the automotive consultant. The cognitive decline inquiry to Dr. Foss. The photograph Edgar had taken of Derek at my side door. Catherine Mercer did not speak for a long time. She moved from document to document with the methodical intensity of a surgeon assessing the extent of an injury before deciding where to cut. When she finally looked up, her professional mask had slipped just enough for me to see the edge of something I recognized. It was the same expression I wore when I found a crack in a load-bearing member. The realization that what you are looking at is not just damaged, it is dangerous. "Mr. Kane," she said, her voice dropping into a register that told me we had moved beyond civil litigation. "This is not a family law matter. This is not even a state-level financial crime. The moment your daughter commissioned that firmware patch and deployed it through an interstate digital network, she crossed into federal territory. We are looking at wire fraud, computer fraud, under the CFAA, and attempted murder by means of a cyber weapon." She picked up her phone and made a single call. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. When she hung up, she told me that a contact at the FBI's Cyber Division field office in Boston had agreed to meet us that afternoon. His name was Agent Dominic Farrow, and he had apparently been waiting for someone to hand him the final piece of a puzzle he had been assembling for months. We drove to the field office together in Catherine's sedan, the city traffic crawling past us, while my mind calculated the structural implications of what she had told me. Federal. The word carried a weight that state charges did not. Federal meant no bail reductions from a sympathetic local judge. Federal meant sentencing guidelines that measured punishment in decades, not years. Agent Dominic Farrow met us in a conference room that smelled of recycled air and the faint chemical tang of electronics. He was 48, built like a middleweight who had traded the ring for a badge, with eyes that held the patient, predatory focus of a man who spent his career hunting people who thought their crimes were invisible because they were committed through fiber optic cables instead of crowbars. He listened to my account without interrupting. When I finished, he opened a laptop and turned the screen toward me. On it was a surveillance summary document, with a header that made the air leave my lungs. FBI Cyber Division. Financial Crimes Task Force. Subject: Kane Digital Ventures, LLC. Investigation opened. 14 months prior. "Your daughter's company has been on our radar for over a year, Mr. Kane," Farrow said, his voice carrying the low, steady cadence of a diesel engine at idle. "Tax. Irregularities. Suspicious wire transfers through shell accounts. A pattern of financial manipulation that suggested someone was building a house of cards with other people's money. But we could not identify the source of the seed capital. Until today." He tapped the screen. "You just handed me the foundation of her entire operation. Every dollar she laundered through that startup originated in your accounts. You are the source we have been looking for." Catherine leaned forward. "The vehicle modification. The ABS hack. Where does that fall in your jurisdiction?" Farrow's expression shifted. It was subtle, a tightening around the eyes that I recognized as the same look I got when I found a fracture in a primary structural member. "That is not just wire fraud anymore, counselor. That is attempted first-degree murder, executed via a cyber weapon deployed across state infrastructure. My office has concurrent jurisdiction with the district attorney. This goes to a federal grand jury." He closed the laptop and looked at me directly. "Mr. Kane, we have had a technical surveillance warrant on her company's server for 3 months. We have already recovered metadata that suggests she deleted a significant volume of files in the 72 hours following your wife's accident. But here is what she does not understand about digital forensics." He paused, the ghost of something hard and satisfied crossing his face. "Deletion is not destruction. It is just burial, and we are very good at exhumation." He stood and extended his hand across the table. "I am going to need 48 hours to secure an expanded warrant that covers the physical premises and all network devices. In that time, I need you to have zero contact with your daughter. Do not call. Do not text. Do not respond to anything she sends. She needs to believe she is still invisible." I shook his hand. His grip was the same as Edgar's. Firm. Certain. The grip of a man who built things that held. "One more thing," Pharaoh said as Catherine and I gathered our documents. "There is a file on that server she thinks she erased 3 days ago. A planning document with a project codename. Our ghost recovery team has already reconstructed 80% of it from the server's shadow copies. When we execute the warrant, that file is going to be the centerpiece of the indictment." "What is the codename?" I asked. Pharaoh looked at me with eyes that held no warmth. Only the cold mechanical certainty of a man who had found the exact coordinates of a wreck. "Project Lighthouse," he said. "Your daughter named her plan to destroy your family after a structure designed to guide ships safely home." The irony settled into my chest, like an anchor dropping into deep water. She had taken the one thing I spent my life building, safety, and turned it into the codename for annihilation. I walked out of that building into the fading Boston afternoon and felt for the first time the tide beginning to turn. In the digital world, deletion is an illusion. When you drag a file to the trash and empty it, you have not destroyed anything. You have simply removed the signpost that points to where the data lives on the disk. The information itself remains there, buried in the magnetic substrate, like a body under shallow soil, waiting for someone with the right tools and the right patience to dig it up. My daughter built her career on technology. She should have known that the ocean never forgets what sinks into it. Every wreck leaves a shadow on the seafloor. 48 hours after our meeting at the field office, Agent Pharaoh called me at 6 in the morning. His voice was flat and controlled. But beneath the professional surface, I could hear something that sounded almost like awe. He asked me to come to the FBI's Digital Forensics Laboratory on the 5th floor of the federal building. He said the ghost team had finished their reconstruction. He said I needed to see it in person. I drove to Boston in silence, the radio off. The only sound, the rhythmic thump of my tires on the interstate expansion joints. When I arrived, Pharaoh met me at the security desk and escorted me through a series of locked doors into a room that hummed with the white noise of cooling fans and the faint ozone smell of machines thinking at speeds no human mind could match. The forensics lab was a long, windowless space filled with servers and workstations, their screens casting a blue glow that made everything look submerged. 2 technicians sat at terminals, their fingers moving across keyboards with the quiet intensity of surgeons performing microsurgery. Pharaoh led me to a central monitor and pulled up a file directory that made my stomach drop through the floor. Project Lighthouse. Master planning document. Created 17 months ago. Last modified 71 hours after the crash. She thought she wiped it, Pharaoh said, pulling a chair out for me. She used a commercial data destruction tool on the night of your wife's accident. Probably did it from her phone while she was telling you to stop being dramatic. But enterprise servers create shadow copies every 6 hours. She did not know about the backup protocol her own IT contractor installed. We recovered 93% of the original document. He clicked open the file, and the screen filled with what I can only describe as the architectural blueprint for the systematic erasure of 2 human lives. It was organized into 3 phases, each with its own timeline, budget allocation, and risk assessment. My daughter had planned the destruction of her family with the same meticulous project management methodology she used to pitch investors. Phase 1 was labeled Capital Acquisition. Duration: 24 months. It detailed the forged power of attorney, the email redirect, the systematic extraction of funds, and the HELOC application. Each step had a completion checkbox. Every single box was ticked. She had graded herself on the thoroughness of robbing her own parents. Phase 2 was labeled Liability Resolution. The clinical language made bile rise in my throat. Liability. That is what she called her mother. A line item to be resolved. This section detailed the ABS firmware modification, the selection of Route 128 as the optimal location based on gradient analysis and traffic patterns, and a contingency plan labeled Alternative Medical Event that described a method for inducing a fatal drug interaction using Deborah's existing prescriptions if the vehicle approach failed. She had a backup plan for killing her mother. A backup plan. Phase 3 was labeled Estate Consolidation. Duration: 30 to 60 days. Post-resolution. It outlined the conservatorship filing for me, the immediate listing of our home through a private pocket sale, the liquidation of all physical assets including my workshop tools and Deborah's book collection, and the transfer of all proceeds to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. The final line item read, Subject RC. Placed at Granite Shores. Projected timeline to natural conclusion, 3 to 5 years. Natural conclusion. She was planning to wait for me to die in a locked ward while she sipped cocktails in the Caribbean on the proceeds of her mother's murder and her father's imprisonment. Pharaoh let me sit with it for a full minute before he spoke again. There is more, he said, and I could tell from the weight in his voice that more was worse. He pulled up a message log recovered from an encrypted communication app that Cassandra and Derek had used exclusively for discussing the plan. The timestamps spanned 8 months. I read them in sequence, each message landing like a hammer blow on a hull that was already condemned. August 12th. Cassandra to Derek. The ABS patch is live. Tested on a simulator. 1 hard brake application on a downhill grade above 45 miles per hour, and the system locks full. No dashboard warning. No evidence trail. Clean. August 19th. Derek to Cassandra. Your mother mentioned the brakes feel soft. She wants to take it to the shop. Handle it. August 20th. Cassandra to Derek. Told her it was just the humidity affecting the pedal feel. She bought it. Clock is ticking. September 3rd. The night before the crash. Cassandra to Derek. Tomorrow she drives to her reading group in Essex. Route 128. Mile marker, 47. Downhill curve. Estimated impact speed, 60 plus. Insurance adjuster already pre-selected. Keep your phone clean. And stay visible at the gym. I pushed back from the monitor and pressed my palms flat against the desk. The room felt like it was compressing around me. The cooling fans roaring like the engine room of a vessel taking on water from every seam. Pharaoh closed the messages and opened one final file. An audio recording recovered from the app's cached data. He pressed play, and my daughter's voice filled the laboratory, clear and casual and utterly devoid of anything resembling a human conscience. The old man is too analog to catch a digital thief, Bex. She was laughing. The sound was light, almost playful, as if she were discussing a prank rather than the premeditated murder of her mother. By the time the hull fills up, we will be in the Caymans counting zeros. Nature just needs a little push. That is all this is. A push. Pharaoh stopped the recording. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard. We have everything, he said, standing up from his terminal with the controlled finality of a man closing a case file. Motive. Method. Premeditation. Digital confession. This is not circumstantial, Mr. Kane. This is airtight. He looked at me across the blue glow of the screens. The tactical team assembles at 0500 tomorrow morning. By 0600, your daughter and her husband will be in federal custody. I need you to go home tonight and stay there. Do not answer her calls. Do not give her any reason to suspect the tide has turned. I stood up from the chair, my joints feeling like rusted pintles in a neglected rudder assembly. I looked at the screen one last time. Project Lighthouse. A structure built to guide ships home, repurposed as the code name for a plan to send mine to the bottom. I walked out of that building into the cold Boston evening and drove home to Gloucester with my hands steady on the wheel and a hollow certainty in my chest that tomorrow morning the sea would finally claim what it was owed. There is a cold that does not come from the ocean. It does not blow in off the Atlantic or settle with the fog on Gloucester Harbor. It is the cold that forms inside your marrow when you are sitting in the dark, waiting to watch your only child be taken away in handcuffs. I know both kinds of cold now. The ocean cold is honest. It tells you exactly what it is and what it will take from you if you are not prepared. The other kind lies dormant in your bones, like a disease you did not know you carried until the morning it finally shows itself. I left Gloucester at 4:15 in the morning, the roads empty and black, the headlights of my truck cutting through a mist that clung to Route 128 like a shroud. I did not turn on the radio. I did not want noise. I wanted the silence to prepare me for what I was about to witness, the controlled demolition of something I had spent 38 years building with my bare hands. By 5:40, I was parked on a side street half a block from the Seaport District Tower, where Cassandra lived on the 22nd floor. The building was a monument to the kind of glass and steel ambition that looked beautiful from a distance, but offered no warmth up close. I could see her floor from where I sat. The lights were off. She was sleeping, dreaming whatever dreams fill the mind of a woman who has spent 2 years cannibalizing her parents, and somehow convinced herself she deserves the comfort of Egyptian cotton sheets paid for with their blood. At 5:52, the first unmarked vehicles appeared at the corners of the block. Black Suburbans, with tinted windows sliding into position, like chess pieces being placed by an invisible hand. There were no sirens, no lights, just the quiet, predatory choreography of federal law enforcement executing a pre-dawn tactical warrant. I watched through my windshield as a team of agents in dark tactical gear moved toward the building's service entrance. Their movements were fluid and rehearsed, the kind of coordinated precision that comes from training for exactly this moment. A building security guard was met at the door and shown a warrant. He stepped aside without a word, his face a mask of someone who understood that whatever was happening was above his pay grade. The elevators were locked down. I knew this because Pharaoh had briefed me on the operational plan the night before. Stairwell access only. 22 floors climbed in formation while the subject slept above them, unaware that the digital fortress she had built was being breached by men who carried badges instead of keyboards. I sat in my truck and counted the minutes. 5:55. 5:58. 6:01. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant sound of harbor traffic and the rhythmic tick of my cooling engine. At 6:04, a sharp sound reached me through the morning air. Not a crash. A controlled breach. The heavy thud of a ram against a reinforced door frame, followed by the distant, muffled announcement that I could not hear clearly, but knew by heart from every crime documentary Deborah had ever watched. FBI. Federal warrant. Do not move. I imagined the scene I could not see. The master bedroom with its harbor view suddenly flooded with tactical flashlights. Cassandra jolting upright in silk pajamas, her face cycling through confusion, rage, and the first genuine fear she had probably felt since childhood. Derek beside her, his gambler's instincts already calculating the odds and finding them terminal. 7 minutes later, my phone buzzed with a text from Pharaoh. Secured. Both subjects in custody. No resistance from male subject. Female subject attempted to offer financial consideration to arresting agents. Funds already frozen. Offer declined. She had tried to bribe the FBI with money stolen from me. The arrogance of the act was so absolute it circled past offensive and arrived at something almost pitiable. Almost. At 6:19, the lobby doors of the tower opened, and the morning changed shape. Two agents emerged first, scanning the street with professional alertness. Then came Derek Merritt, his hands zip-tied behind his back, wearing a pair of gray silk pajamas that probably cost more than a week's wages for the men escorting him. His face was the color of old putty, his eyes vacant and fixed on the ground. He looked like a man who had finally calculated the house edge and realized it had been against him all along. Behind him came Cassandra. She was in a cream silk nightgown, her hair a tangled mess around her face, her bare feet on the cold concrete of the sidewalk. She was not quiet. She was screaming, a shrill, jagged sound that cut through the still morning air like a hull scraping against a reef. She was shouting about her attorneys, about her rights, about the violation of her privacy and her reputation and her schedule. The narcissism was a physical force, radiating outward, even as the agents guided her toward the waiting vehicle, with the patient efficiency of professionals who had heard it all before. Derek spotted my truck then. His eyes went wide and his body lurched against the zip ties. "Russell!" he shouted, his voice cracking like a dry timber under too much load. "Russell! Tell them it was all her." I just did what she told me. I did not know about the brakes. I swear, I did not know. I stayed in the dark cab of my truck. My hands were on the steering wheel. My face was stone. I did not move. I did not blink. I offered nothing. Not a word. Not a nod. Not even the dignity of acknowledgement. Cassandra heard his shout and turned. For one instant, her eyes found my truck across the distance, and the screaming stopped. Her face shifted, the rage dissolving into something else. A practiced, childlike vulnerability that I had seen deployed 1,000 times since she was old enough to want something she had not earned. Her lips moved, forming a word I could read, but chose not to hear. "Daddy." I watched the agent's hand press down on the top of her head as she was guided into the back seat of the Suburban. The door closed with a sound that carried a finality no amount of attorneys or bail hearings would ever undo. It was the sound of a vessel being struck from the register. Decommissioned. No longer fit for sea. I sat in that truck until the convoy pulled away, until the street returned to its normal morning rhythm, until the only evidence of what had just happened was a scuff mark on the sidewalk where her bare feet had dragged. Then I started the engine and drove back to Gloucester. Back to the hospital. Back to Deborah. I was halfway across the Tobin Bridge when my phone buzzed again. Not Faro this time. The caller ID read Addison Gilbert Hospital, ICU nursing station. I pulled to the shoulder and read the message with hands that finally, after everything, began to shake. "Mr. Kane, this is Nurse Callahan. Please come when you can. Your wife is showing purposeful eye movement and attempting to vocalize. Dr. Anderson is on his way in. She is waking up." The morning light hit the harbor as I merged back onto the highway. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, it did not look like the cold gray of a condemned hull. It looked like dawn. The sea gives back what it takes, but never in the form you lost it. A vessel that goes down whole comes back as scattered planking and twisted fastenings spread across the sea floor. The shape is gone. The function is gone. Only the materials remain, rearranged by forces you cannot negotiate with. I learned this truth in the shipyard long before I learned it in a hospital room, watching my wife open her eyes for the first time in weeks and look at me as though I were a stranger standing in the wrong doorway. I reached Addison Gilbert at 8:40 that morning, still carrying the ghost weight of what I had witnessed in the Seaport District. The parking lot smelled like salt in October and something medicinal that seeped from the building's ventilation system. I walked through the automatic doors with the gait of a man who had not slept in 36 hours. My boots finding the familiar path to the ICU without conscious direction. Dr. Anderson met me outside Deborah's room. His face held the cautious optimism of a surgeon who knows the body is healing, but cannot yet speak for the mind. He explained that Deborah had regained consciousness approximately 40 minutes before my arrival. Her vital signs were stable. Her motor function appeared intact. But there was a complication. Retrograde amnesia, he said. His voice measured and clinical. Her last consistent memory appears to be from approximately 8 months ago. Everything between then and now is either fragmented or absent. This is not uncommon with her type of injury, but I need to prepare you, Mr. Kane. The woman in that room does not know what has happened to her. She does not know why she is here, and she does not know what her daughter has done. 8 months. The amnesia had swallowed the entire timeline of Cassandra's escalation. To Deborah, it was still early spring. She still believed her daughter was a successful entrepreneur who called every Sunday and brought lavender lattes to their kitchen table. She still trusted the world I had spent the last 72 hours proving was built on sand. I pushed open the door and saw her propped against the pillows, her face pale and thin, but her eyes open and tracking. The ventilator was gone, replaced by a nasal cannula that hissed its quiet supply. She looked smaller than I remembered, as though the coma had consumed some essential mass that gave her presence its usual gravity. But she was alive. She was breathing on her own, and when she saw me, she smiled. Russell. Her voice was a thin rasp, like a line running through a rusted block. Why am I here? What happened? Did I fall? I sat on the edge of the bed and took her hand. Her fingers felt like paper wrapped around bird bones, fragile in a way that made my throat close. I told her about the accident. Route 128. The car. The surgery. I kept my voice steady. The way you keep your hand steady when you are cutting away damaged planking near a critical frame. One wrong move, and the whole structure shifts. She listened with a confused focus, her brow creasing as she tried to match my words with a memory that no longer existed. Then she asked the question I had been dreading since Dr. Anderson said the word amnesia. Where is Cassandra? Does she know I am here? She must be so worried. I felt the words form in my chest and die before they reached my tongue. How do you tell a woman who has just returned from the edge of death that the daughter she loves tried to push her over it? How do you explain that the child she nursed and raised and defended for 38 years had been quietly calculating the actuarial value of her death for almost 2 years? Deborah, I began, choosing each word with the care of a man setting charges in a demolition. There are some things that happened while you were asleep. Things involving Cassandra. Things that are difficult to explain. Her face changed immediately. The soft confusion hardened into something I recognized from 41 years of marriage. It was the expression she wore when she believed I was being unfair to our daughter, the mama bear emerging from hibernation, with her claws already extended. What did you do, Russell? Her voice gained strength, fueled by a protective instinct that no amount of evidence could override without a fight. Did you two have another argument about her company? You have always been jealous of her success. You never supported her the way a father should. The accusation landed like a mallet on a copper rivet. Jealous. She thought I was jealous of the woman who had stolen $500,000 from us and tried to kill her with a software patch. Deborah, this is not about jealousy. Cassandra has been arrested. She was taken into federal custody this morning. She stole our money. All of it. She forged my signature, and she tampered with your car. The accident was not an accident. Deborah's eyes went wide and then narrow. The heart monitor beside her bed began to climb, the steady beep accelerating into something urgent. She pulled her hand away from mine, as though my skin had burned her. You are lying. The words came out with a force that surprised us both. You have always resented her. You wanted her to fail, so she would come crawling back to that workshop of yours. Cassandra would never hurt me. She loves me. She is my daughter. Deborah, please listen to me. I have the evidence. The bank records. The forged documents. There are recordings. Get out. Her voice was a blade now, sharp and final. Get out of this room. I want Cassandra. I want to talk to my daughter. You are a bitter, jealous old man, and I will not listen to this poison." The monitor screamed its alarm. Nurse Callahan rushed in, followed by an aide, their bodies moving with the practiced urgency of people trained to respond to cardiac escalation. Callahan looked at me with an expression that was part sympathy and part professional command. "Mr. Kane, I need you to step out. Her heart rate is at 142. We need to bring her down before we risk another event." I stood up from the bed, my legs feeling like ballast being shifted in a heavy sea. Deborah's eyes followed me to the door. Not with love, but with the fierce, wounded certainty of a mother who believed she was protecting her child from a liar. "I know my daughter, Russell." Her voice chased me into the corridor, raw and cracking. "She would never hurt me. Never." The door closed between us and I stood in the hallway with the manila folder pressed against my chest, listening to the muffled sounds of the nurses working to calm a woman who did not yet know that the daughter she was defending had bet her life on a brake failure and a downhill curve. There was only one way to reach her now. Not with my words, which she had already decided were poison. Not with bank statements or forensic reports that would look like abstract numbers to a woman who had just woken from a coma. I needed something she could not argue with, something she would recognize with her own eyes. The camera, the one she herself had installed in the hallway of our home 6 months ago, hidden inside the frame of a nautical print because, as she told me at the time with a strange, quiet certainty, "My medication tastes different lately, Russell. And I want to know why." She had been watching. Even before I knew there was something to watch for, Deborah had felt the rot in the wood, and she had planted her own evidence before the storm took her down. I walked toward the exit, pulling out my phone to call Edgar. I needed the footage from that camera, and I needed it before Cassandra found a way to reach Deborah from a jail cell and rebuild the illusion that was already crumbling. An old fisherman in Gloucester once told me that truth is like a tsunami. You cannot stop it. You cannot redirect it. You can only choose whether you are standing on high ground when it arrives or whether you are down on the beach pretending the water will not come. I had spent the previous night on high ground, watching the wave build. Now I had to bring Deborah to the hilltop before it swept away everything she still believed about the daughter who had tried to kill her. Edgar retrieved the camera footage that same afternoon. The device was still where Deborah had hidden it, inside the hollow frame of a 19th century nautical chart that hung in the hallway between our bedroom and my office. It was a pinhole camera, the kind sold for home security. No bigger than a shirt button. Edgar found it only because I told him exactly where to look, based on what Deborah had whispered to me months ago in a moment I had dismissed as anxiety. "My medication tastes different lately, Russell." That was all she had said. I told her it was probably a new generic formulation from the pharmacy. I told her not to worry. I went back to sanding a hull plank, while my wife quietly purchased a surveillance camera and hid it in our hallway because some part of her already knew what I was too blind to see. The footage covered 6 months. Edgar brought it to me on a flash drive the following morning, and I spent 3 hours reviewing it on my laptop in the hospital cafeteria before I was ready to show Deborah. What I saw confirmed everything the FBI had found digitally, but in a format that no amount of amnesia could argue with. Cassandra entering our home with her own key at 11:30 at night while we slept. Moving through the hallway to my office with the practiced silence of someone who had done this many times. Spending 40 minutes in front of my file cabinet, photographing documents with her phone, removing originals and replacing them with forgeries she carried in her bag. Derek appearing 2 weeks later with a small toolkit, disabling the exterior camera on the porch, then entering through the side door. Spending time in the kitchen where Deborah kept her medications in a weekly pill organizer on the counter. His hands moving over the small compartments, with the quick efficiency of someone following instructions. And the morning of the accident. September 4th. 7:12 in the morning. Cassandra arriving while I was already at my workshop, and Deborah was preparing to leave for her reading group. The camera captured her hugging her mother in the hallway, then reaching for Deborah's coat, adjusting the collar. And then, with a casual gesture that looked like tenderness, running her hand across Deborah's seatbelt strap as she helped her into her jacket. She was not being affectionate. She was confirming the restraint system was functional, making sure her mother would remain in the driver's seat when the ABS failed on the downhill curve at mile marker 47, ensuring the impact would be direct and devastating rather than allowing an ejection that might result in survival. I closed the laptop and sat for a long time staring at the cafeteria wall. Then I gathered the flash drive, the printed forgery practice sheets I had found in my office, and the bank statements Catherine had organized into a timeline. I put them all in a folder and walked upstairs. Deborah was sitting up when I entered. Her color better than yesterday. Her eyes clear and wary. She looked at me the way a sailor looks at a weather front approaching from the west. She knew something was coming, but she was not sure yet whether to run or hold course. "I am not here to argue, Deborah," I said, pulling the chair close to her bedside. My voice was as steady as a keel beam. "I am here to show you something, and I am asking you, as your husband of 41 years, to look at it with the same eyes you used when you decided to put that camera in our hallway." Her breath caught. I saw the moment she remembered. The camera, her secret, her own quiet audit, conducted in the dark, months before the storm hit. "You knew something was wrong," I continued. "You told me the medication tasted different. I did not listen. But you listened to yourself. You put that camera there because you already felt what I was too stubborn to see." I opened the laptop and pressed play. Deborah watched in silence. Her face did not change at first. The footage of Cassandra entering at night could have been innocent. A daughter checking on her parents. But as the minutes accumulated, as the file cabinet was opened and documents were removed and replaced, I watched the architecture of denial begin to fracture in my wife's eyes. I showed her the practice sheets next. Dozens of pages where Cassandra had spent hours perfecting the slant of the R in Russell and the loop of the C in Kane. Rows and rows of forgery laid out in her distinctive sharp handwriting. A daughter's love expressed in the calligraphy of theft. Deborah's fingers hovered over the paper without touching it, as though it might burn her skin. She was practicing. She whispered. Like homework. Like it was just an assignment. Then I showed her the morning of September 4th. I showed her the hug in the hallway. I showed her Cassandra's hand running across the seatbelt with that casual, careful precision. Deborah's face went still. Not the stillness of calm, but the stillness of a structure that has just received its terminal load and is deciding whether to stand or collapse. She was not checking because she cared, Deborah said, her voice barely audible above the hum of the monitors. She was making sure I stayed in the seat. I did not speak. There was nothing to add. The evidence spoke with a clarity that no husband's words could improve upon. Deborah sat with it for a long time. The heart monitor beeped its steady rhythm. The sunlight shifted across the floor. Outside, I could hear the distant cry of gulls over the harbor. A sound so normal, it felt like an insult to the moment we were living through. When she finally looked at me, there were no tears. There was something worse than tears. There was the hollow, gray-stone expression of a mother whose child has just been reclassified from beloved to predator. "She wanted me dead for money," Deborah said. Not a question. A statement. A reading from the captain's log that could never be unwritten. "Yes," I said. Deborah pushed the papers away slowly, as though they were contaminated. She looked at the wall for a long moment, then back at me with eyes that had aged a decade in the space of 10 minutes. "Call the attorney, Russell." Her voice was quiet but carried the weight of anchor chain dropping into deep water. "I want to sign the restraining order. I want my name removed from anything she can touch. And then I want to hear every single voicemail she left from that jail cell. Every one. I want to hear what she sounds like when she is the one who cannot breathe." I took her hand. She let me. And for the first time since the ventilator was removed, my wife squeezed back. In maritime law, a distress signal is sacred. When a vessel sends an SOS, every ship within range is legally and morally obligated to respond. But there is another kind of signal that looks like distress but is not. It is the call of a ship that has run aground on its own recklessness and is now demanding that others risk their hulls to pull it free from rocks it chose to sail toward. That is the sound my phone made for 3 weeks straight. 42 calls from Essex County Correctional Facility. Not one of them a genuine distress signal. Every single one a demand. I sat in my kitchen on a Tuesday night, 3 weeks after the arrest. The house dark, except for the glow of the stove clock reading 11:14. The phone lay on the counter like a dead thing, its screen occasionally lighting up with the now familiar caller ID, Essex County Correctional. I had been cataloging the calls in a notebook the way I would log stress test results on a load-bearing structure. Date, time, duration of ring, a clinical record of narcissism measured in rejected connections. 41 calls over 21 days. I had listened to none of them. I had let each one ring out into the darkness and returned to whatever institutional voicemail system collected the pleas of the incarcerated. But tonight was different. Tonight Deborah had asked me to listen, and tonight I had Catherine Mercer's digital recording application running on my laptop, capturing every sound that came through the speaker with the fidelity of a black box recorder. The 42nd call came at 11:19. The phone lit up and began its mechanical pulse against the granite countertop. I looked at it for 3 full rings, steadying my breathing the way I steady my hands before making a critical cut on irreplaceable timber. Then I reached out and accepted the charges. Dad. Her voice poured through the speaker like contaminated bilge water. Frantic. Breathless. Stripped of every layer of designer poise she had worn for 38 years. Oh, thank God. Thank God you finally picked up. You have to get me out of here, Russell. This place is disgusting. The women in here are animals. My attorney says bail is $750,000. You have the insurance payout from Mom's policy. Use it. Use it. And get me out tonight. I let the silence hang between us for 5 full seconds. The recording application's waveform pulsed red on my laptop screen, capturing every syllable. The insurance payout, I said, my voice as flat as the hull of a vessel in dry dock. You mean the $1.2 million in policies you took out on your mother's life, the ones you changed the beneficiary on with a forged signature from Victor Hale? She did not even pause. There was no flinch in her voice. No shame. She simply pivoted the way a current changes direction when it hits an obstacle. That money was always meant for the family, Dad. I was managing our portfolio. I was trying to build something for all of us. You just do not understand modern financial planning. How are the sheets in there, Cassandra? I asked, my tone carrying a coldness I did not know I possessed. I imagine they are not Egyptian cotton. Do not mock me. Her voice sharpened into something metallic. I am your daughter. I built a company from nothing. I am not supposed to be in here with these people. From nothing. I repeated the words slowly, letting each syllable land with the weight of a hammer, driving a fastening home. You built it from $380,000 stolen from your parents' retirement. You built it from $130,000 borrowed against our home with a forged signature. You built it from a dead woman's insurance policy. Except she is not dead, Cassandra. Your mother is alive. She is awake. And she has seen the camera footage. The silence on the other end lasted 4 seconds. When she spoke again, her voice had shifted into something I had never heard before. Not fear exactly. Recalculation. The sound of a navigator realizing the charts have changed and the harbor she was aiming for no longer exists. The camera, she said slowly. What camera? The one your mother installed 6 months ago because her medication started tasting different. The one that recorded you entering our home at night. The one that recorded Derek in our kitchen with her pill organizer. The one that recorded you checking her seatbelt on the morning of September 4th. Another silence. Longer this time. I could hear the ambient noise of the correctional facility behind her. Metal doors. Distant voices. The institutional hum of a building designed to contain people who had forfeited their right to freedom. Dad. Her voice changed again. Softer now. The little girl voice. The one she deployed at age 6 when she wanted candy, and at age 16 when she wanted car keys, and at age 34 when she wanted a startup loan that was actually the first installment of a theft. Daddy, listen. I was under so much pressure. The company was failing. Derek had debts. I just needed a bridge loan. I never meant for anyone to get hurt. It got out of control. You searched for ABS vulnerabilities 6 weeks before the crash, I said. You commissioned a custom firmware patch. You canceled your mother's brake service update. You told Derek, and I quote, "One hard brake application on a downhill grade above 45, and the system locks full." The little girl vanished. What replaced her was something I had never met before. A voice stripped of all performance, all manipulation, all pretense. The raw machinery beneath the human costume. I cannot wait 30 years for an inheritance, Dad. The words came out flat, mechanical, devoid of apology. Nature needed a push. That is all it was. A push in the right direction. The system failed. Not me. If the brakes had held 3 more weeks, the funding would have closed and none of this would have mattered. I closed my eyes. There it was. Recorded in pristine digital clarity on Catherine Mercer's forensic application. A confession. Not coerced. Not ambiguous. A daughter explaining that her mother's murder was simply a business decision that did not execute on schedule. 42 calls. Cassandra, I said, my voice dropping to the whisper of a man cutting the last mooring line. Not once did you ask if she was alive. Not once did you ask if she could speak. Not once did you ask if her heart was still beating. I was stressed, Dad. I am the victim here. The system is designed to crush entrepreneurs who think differently, and Deborah is awake, I said, cutting through the noise like a saw through rotten timber. She signed the restraining order this morning. She has seen everything. The forgery sheets, the camera footage, the insurance policies. She knows exactly what her daughter is. The silence that followed was absolute. Not the silence of shock. The silence of a vessel that has finally, completely, run out of sea room. I am not your father anymore, Cassandra. I said the words with the calm finality of a man signing a condemnation order on a vessel that cannot be saved. I am a witness, and this conversation has been recorded in its entirety. I pressed the end call button. Then I opened the settings, navigated to her contact, and blocked the number permanently. The screen went dark. The kitchen went silent. The recording application showed a clean waveform of 19 minutes and 43 seconds of confession. I closed the laptop, set my phone face down on the counter, and sat in the darkness, listening to nothing at all. It was the most peaceful silence I had experienced in months. The signal had finally stopped, and the shore was quiet. A courtroom is built the same way a ship is built. Plank by plank. Frame by frame. Each piece of evidence is a fastening driven into the structure until the hull is watertight, and there is no gap through which the accused can slip back into open water. I walked into Federal Courthouse, Boston on a cold November morning with my tie knotted tight against my throat and 40 years of structural knowledge telling me that what we had built over the past 2 months was airtight. No leaks, no flex in the joints, no possibility of failure under load. The courtroom was cavernous and cold. Its marble walls and high ceilings designed to remind everyone present that the weight of the state was not a metaphor. I took my seat in the front row of the gallery, my back straight as a mast, my hands folded in my lap with a stillness that had taken weeks to achieve. Catherine Mercer sat beside me, her posture equally composed, a leather folio resting on her knees like a weapon in its holster. Cassandra was brought in through a side door at 9:15. The transformation was severe. The designer wardrobe was gone, replaced by a navy blue suit that her court-appointed attorney had likely selected from a discount rack. Her hair was pulled back in a style that suggested discipline, but could not hide the sallowness of her skin under the fluorescent lights. She had lost weight. The angles of her face were sharper now, predatory in a way that the makeup and cashmere used to soften. She scanned the room the moment she entered, and when her eyes found mine, she attempted something. A look, a softening of the features that might have read as remorse to someone who had not spent 40 years reading the grain of deceptive materials. I recognized it for what it was. Performance. The same muscle memory that had produced Daddy in the back of an FBI Suburban. I gave her nothing. My face was granite. My eyes were the eyes of an inspector at a condemnation hearing. I was not here as a father. I was here as the lead witness in a federal case that carried a combined maximum sentence of 67 years. Prosecutor Elena Martinez rose from her table with the controlled energy of a woman who had spent 3 months building a vessel of evidence and was now ready to launch it. She was 45. Compact, with dark eyes that held the kind of focused intensity I associated with master welders, people who understood that precision was the difference between a joint that held and one that failed catastrophically. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice filling the courtroom without effort. "This case is not about a family disagreement or a financial misunderstanding. This is about a calculated, premeditated campaign to murder a 64-year-old woman for financial gain, executed through a cyber weapon deployed against a civilian vehicle on a public highway." She introduced the 9 counts. Attempted first-degree murder, 3 counts of wire fraud, 2 counts of forgery, insurance fraud, computer fraud, under the CFAA, conspiracy to commit murder. Each count landed in the silent courtroom like a fastening being driven home. Martinez then did something I had not anticipated. She played the 42 calls. Not all of them. Not in their entirety, but enough. She played excerpts from the first call, where Cassandra complained about the quality of the water. She played the 7th, where Cassandra demanded Derek find her designer vitamins. She played the 19th, where Cassandra spent 4 minutes discussing her skincare routine without once mentioning her mother. Vitamins, thread count, skincare, while a machine breathed for the woman who gave her life. I watched the jury. A retired teacher in the front row pressed a crumpled tissue against her eyes. A young man in the back row stared at Cassandra with an expression I recognized from my own mirror. Clinical judgment. The assessment of a structure that has been found fundamentally unsound. Then Martinez played the 42nd call. The full 19 minutes and 43 seconds. My voice. Cassandra's voice. The confession delivered in the flat mechanical tone of a woman explaining that her mother's attempted murder was simply a business expense that did not yield returns on schedule. Nature needed a push. The words echoed off the marble walls and settled into every corner of the room like contaminated ballast water. Several jurors were openly weeping. One man in the second row removed his glasses and pressed his palms against his eyes, as though trying to unsee what he had just heard. When the recording ended, Martinez turned to the bench. "The state calls Russell Emmett Kane." I stood up. My legs felt like iron keel bolts, heavy but certain. I walked to the witness stand and placed my hand on the Bible, feeling the worn leather under my palm like the surface of a well-used tool. I took the oath and sat down, my eyes scanning the room one final time before I began. I told them about the night in the ICU, about the declined cards and the empty accounts, about Edgar's photograph of Derek at my door, about the forgery practice sheets and the ABS firmware log, and the folder labeled Project Lighthouse. I spoke for 45 minutes, with the steady precision of a man delivering a structural survey report. No emotion, no embellishment, just the data. When I finished my direct examination, defense attorney Whitfield rose for cross-examination. He was a tall man with silver hair and a suit that cost more than a month of my pension. His smile was the smile of someone who believed he had found a crack in the hull. "Mr. Kane," he said, approaching the stand with a glossy photograph in his hand. "You describe yourself as a master shipbuilder. A man who finds flaws, invisible to others. He slapped the photo down on the rail. Do you recognize this vessel? I looked at it. The Meridian. A 70-foot research trawler I had supervised the refit of in 2019. A project that had developed a structural issue in the forward frames 6 months after completion. A warranty claim. My one professional blemish in 4 decades. Is it not true, Whitfield continued, that you missed a critical flaw in this vessel's framing that resulted in a $600,000 repair? Is it not possible that your accusations against your daughter are simply another example of a man who sees problems only after the damage is done? I looked at the photograph, then at the jury, then back at Whitfield. I know that vessel, counselor, I said, my voice carrying across the silent room. And I know why it failed. The forward frames were certified by a notary named Victor Hale, who approved substandard lumber grades as marine-rated stock. Victor Hale, the same man who notarized every forged document in this case. The air in the courtroom changed pressure. Whitfield's face went from predatory confidence to the pale stillness of a man who has just realized he stepped onto a condemned deck. He looked back at Cassandra, but she was not looking at him. She was looking at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Fear. Real fear. The kind that does not perform for an audience. Martinez stood slowly, a faint satisfaction visible at the corner of her mouth. No further questions from the state at this time, Your Honor. I remained on the stand, watching Cassandra's composure begin to fracture like ice on a spring river. And then the courtroom doors opened behind me, and I heard a sound that made every head in the room turn. The rhythmic squeak of wheelchair wheels on marble. The sound of those wheels on marble was a metronome. Squeak, squeak, squeak. A slow, rhythmic cadence that measured the final seconds of my daughter's freedom the way a ship's clock measures the minutes before a storm makes landfall. Every head in the courtroom turned toward the center aisle. Every breath in the gallery seemed to suspend itself in the pressurized air. And there was Deborah, being wheeled down the center of that cavernous room by Nurse Callahan, her hands folded in her lap, and her eyes fixed forward with a clarity that I had not seen since before the brakes failed on Route 128. She was thin. The months of coma and recovery had stripped her frame down to something essential, like a vessel that has been hauled out and sanded back to bare wood. But her spine was straight against the back of the wheelchair, and her jaw was set with the quiet determination of a woman who had spent 3 decades as a Navy nurse and knew exactly what it meant to enter a room where life and death decisions were being made. When the wheelchair reached the front of the gallery, Deborah placed both hands on the armrests and began to push herself upward. Nurse Callahan reached for her elbow, but Deborah shook her head with a small, firm gesture. "I can stand, Russell," she said, her voice carrying across the silent courtroom with surprising strength. "I want her to see me standing." I moved to her side and offered my arm. She gripped it with fingers that felt stronger than they had any right to be, after everything her body had endured. She rose to her full height, unsteady but upright, and turned to face the jury box with the bearing of a woman who understood that her presence in this room was more powerful than any document or recording that had preceded her. Prosecutor Martinez approached with the respectful caution of someone handling something both fragile and explosive. "The state calls Deborah Ann Kane." The bailiff brought the Bible. Deborah placed her hand on it and took the oath with a voice that did not waver. Then she sat in the witness chair, adjusting herself with a wince that she tried to hide but could not entirely conceal. The room waited. Martinez began with a simple question. "Mrs. Kane, can you tell the court what you remember about the morning of September 4th? Deborah looked out at the jury and then, for the first time, let her gaze drift to the defense table where Cassandra sat rigid in her Navy suit. The eye contact lasted 3 seconds. It was enough. "I remember my daughter coming to the house that morning," Deborah said, her voice steady and low. "She said she wanted to see me before I left for my reading group. She hugged me in the hallway. She helped me with my coat, and then she did something that I thought was sweet at the time. She ran her hand across my seatbelt strap and tugged it. The way you check a child's car seat. She paused. The courtroom was so silent I could hear the faint electronic hum of the court reporter's machine. I thought she was being protective, Deborah continued. I thought she was making sure I was safe. I did not know she was making sure I would stay in the driver's seat when the brakes stopped working on the hill near mile marker 47. A sound escaped from somewhere in the jury box. A sharp intake of breath. A stifled sob. Martinez presented the next piece of evidence. A small, crumpled piece of paper, sealed in a clear evidence bag. Mrs. Kane, can you identify this document? Deborah looked at it, and her face tightened. Yes. That is a note my daughter left in my hospital room during one of her visits while I was in the coma. She came twice. Both times when Russell was not there. Both times after midnight. Can you read the contents for the court? Deborah took the evidence bag and held it close to her face. Her reading glasses perched on the bridge of her nose. Her voice was flat and clinical as she read. Mom, if you can hear me, know that fighting is pointless. The machines can only keep you here so long. Let go. It will be easier for everyone. Especially Dad. He is already falling apart without you. Do not make him suffer by holding on. The words dropped into the courtroom like depth charges detonating beneath the surface. I watched 3 jurors physically recoil. The retired teacher in the front row covered her mouth with both hands. She was telling me to die, Deborah said, looking up from the note. She was standing beside my bed at 2 in the morning, whispering to a woman in a coma to give up, because every day I stayed alive was a day the insurance money did not clear. Martinez then asked permission to play the video footage from the hallway camera. The judge nodded. The courtroom screens flickered to life, and the gallery saw what I had already shown Deborah weeks ago, Cassandra entering at night. Derek at the pill organizer. The seatbelt check on the morning of the crash. The footage played for 8 minutes in complete silence. When the screens went dark, Deborah turned in the witness chair and looked directly at Cassandra. Not with hatred, not with grief, with the cold, measuring gaze of a mother who has finally accepted that the thing sitting at the defense table is not her child but something that wore her child's face for 38 years. Was the penthouse view worth the sound of my ventilator, Cassandra? Deborah asked, her voice cutting through the air like a wire through foam. Was the marble kitchen worth 3 weeks of watching me drive a car you knew would kill me? Cassandra's composure finally broke. Not into tears. Into rage. She lurched forward against the table, her face contorting into a snarl that stripped away every last layer of the polished facade. That house was rotting, she screamed, her voice echoing off the marble walls. You were rotting in it. Both of you. Wasting everything on that pathetic workshop and those dusty books. I was upgrading your lives. I was building something that mattered. You were too small to see it. Judge Harrington's gavel cracked like a gunshot. The defendant will be silent. But Cassandra was beyond control now. The mask was not just cracked. It was gone. She stood up, her attorney grabbing at her arm, and shouted across the courtroom. I already paid the deposit at Granite Shores. 6 months ago, before any of this happened. Because I knew you would both end up there eventually. I was just accelerating the timeline. That is not a crime. That is efficiency. The silence that followed was total. Absolute. The kind of silence that exists at the bottom of the ocean, where no light reaches. She had just confirmed premeditation in front of a jury, a judge, and a courtroom full of witnesses. She had just confessed that the nursing home plan predated the murder attempt by 6 months. Whitfield sank into his chair with the posture of a man watching his vessel break apart at the waterline. Martinez made a single note on her legal pad. The lead juror wrote something in block letters that I could see from across the room. Deborah sat in the witness chair with her hands folded, watching the outburst with the same expression I imagined she had worn 30 years ago in a Navy trauma ward. Professional. Controlled. Already triaging the damage. I looked at my daughter and felt nothing. Not rage. Not pity. Not love. Only the hollow, clinical certainty that the inspection was complete and the verdict was already written in the grain of the wood. 4 hours. That is how long the jury was out. I have weathered nor'easters that lasted 3 days and felt shorter. I have waited for epoxy to cure on critical joints, knowing that a single degree of temperature variance could compromise the bond, and even those hours passed with more mercy than the ones I spent on that wooden bench outside courtroom 11, while 12 strangers decided whether my daughter would ever breathe free air again. Deborah sat beside me in her wheelchair, a thin wool blanket across her knees that Nurse Callahan had tucked there before leaving us alone in the corridor. We did not speak. There was nothing left to say that the evidence had not already said for us. I held her hand, and she held mine. And we sat in a silence that felt less like emptiness and more like the calm surface of deep water after a storm has finally blown itself out. At 3:47 in the afternoon, the bailiff opened the courtroom doors and told us the jury had reached a verdict. I stood and gripped the handles of Deborah's wheelchair, pushing her back into the room with the same steady rhythm I used when guiding a vessel into its berth. Slow, controlled, no wasted motion. The courtroom filled quickly. Martinez took her place at the prosecution table with the composed stillness of a woman who had done everything in her power and was now prepared to accept whatever the structure would bear. Whitfield sat at the defense table, looking like a man who had already begun drafting his appeal in his head, knowing it would fail. Cassandra was brought back in through the side door. She looked diminished now, as though the outburst on the stand had burned through some essential fuel reserve that had been keeping her upright. Her eyes were glassy and unfocused. She did not look at me. She did not look at Deborah. She stared straight ahead at some fixed point on the far wall, as though she could will herself out of the room by sheer concentration. The jury filed in. 12 faces carrying the weight of what they had heard over the past week. I watched the lead juror, a man in his 50s with the broad hands of someone who worked with them for a living. He did not look at the defense table. He looked directly at Deborah. That single gesture told me everything I needed to know before a word was spoken. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Harrington asked, his voice echoing in the high-ceilinged room. The foreman stood, a single sheet of paper trembling slightly in his thick fingers. "We have, Your Honor, on the count of attempted first-degree murder by means of a cyber weapon." "How does the jury find?" "Guilty." The word fell into the courtroom like an anchor dropped from height. Heavy. Final. Irreversible. Deborah's hand found mine and squeezed with a strength that surprised me. The foreman continued. "Guilty on count 2, wire fraud. Guilty on count 3, wire fraud. Guilty on count 4, wire fraud. Guilty on count 5, forgery. Guilty on count 6, forgery. Guilty on count 7, insurance fraud. Guilty on count 8, computer fraud. Guilty on count 9, conspiracy to commit murder." 9 times the word fell. 9 iron fastenings driven into the hull of a vessel that would never sail again. Cassandra did not move. She sat perfectly still in her chair, as though the words were happening to someone else in a different room. It was only when Judge Harrington began the sentencing phase that the stillness broke. "The court has considered the severity, the premeditation, and the predatory nature of these crimes against the defendant's own parents," Harrington said, his voice carrying the weight of decades on the bench. "The calculated exploitation of familial trust for financial gain, combined with the deliberate attempt to take a human life through technological means, represents a level of moral bankruptcy that this court finds deeply aggravating." He paused and looked directly at Cassandra. 42 years in federal custody. No possibility of parole for a minimum of 35. 42. The same number as the calls. I do not know if the judge intended the symmetry or if the universe simply has a sense of structural poetry that humans cannot escape. Either way, the number hung in the air like the final note of a funeral bell. Cassandra erupted. Not in tears. In a scream that sounded less like grief and more like a machine overheating beyond its tolerance. "This is insane!" she shrieked, her voice cracking against the marble walls. "I am an entrepreneur. I am an innovator. I built something from nothing. The system is broken. This country punishes success. You are all too small to understand what I was building. The bailiffs moved in. She thrashed against them, her body twisting as they guided her arms behind her back. She lunged toward Deborah, her face a contorted mask of something that was not love and was not remorse, but was the raw, panicked fury of a predator that has finally been caged. A deputy stepped between them, his body, a physical wall that enforced the restraining order without a word. It was the first time in Cassandra's life that she could not breach the space of someone she wanted to consume. I watched them lead her toward the side door. Her screaming faded as she was taken deeper into the building, swallowed by the concrete and steel of a structure she could not hack, could not forge, and could not charm her way out of. The door closed behind her with a finality that echoed through the room. Silence. I helped Deborah from her wheelchair, and we walked slowly toward the courtroom exit. We passed the gallery. We passed the cameras. We passed the reporters who shouted questions we did not answer. We moved through it all in a shared, dignified quiet that needed no words because the words had all been said under oath. On the courthouse steps, the November air hit us sharp and cold. The harbor was visible in the distance, gray and flat under an overcast sky. I reached into my jacket pocket and found something I had been carrying for weeks. A small piece of paper, yellowed and soft with age. A crayon drawing Cassandra had made at 8 years old. A ship. A simple, colorful ship, with a smiling sun and waves that looked like blue ribbons. I looked at it for a long moment. Then I set it on the stone railing of the courthouse steps and left it there. A memorial for a daughter who had existed once and was now just a memory I chose to release into the wind. "Where to now, Russell?" Deborah asked, her voice small but steady in the cold air. I took her hand. Her wedding ring pressed cold against my palm. "Home, Deb," I said, and the word felt like the first plank of a new vessel being laid. Solid, true, ready to bear weight. Just home. We descended the steps together, leaving the courthouse and the cameras and the drawing behind us. The car was waiting at the curb. I opened her door and helped her in, then walked around to the driver's side and sat behind the wheel. The drive back to Gloucester took an hour and 14 minutes. Neither of us turned on the radio. When we pulled into the driveway, the porch light was on. Edgar had fixed it that morning. The house looked different in the fading afternoon light. Smaller, maybe, but sound. I helped Deborah inside and we stood together in the foyer, looking down the hallway toward the guest room. Cassandra's room. The door was closed. Behind it, everything she had left behind still waited. The designer clothes, the abandoned files, the expensive perfume that had seeped into the walls. "Tomorrow," I said, looking at the closed door. "Tomorrow, we start the demolition." Deborah leaned against my arm, her weight slight but warm. "Tomorrow," she agreed. And for the first time in months, the word felt like a promise instead of a threat. In the shipyard, there is a process called sistering. When a frame has rotted beyond saving, you do not patch it. You remove the compromised timber entirely and fasten a new piece alongside the remaining sound wood until the structure is stronger than it was before the decay set in. The morning after the verdict, I stood in the doorway of Cassandra's room with a pry bar in one hand and a box of contractor bags in the other, ready to begin the most important sistering job of my life. The room smelled of her. That cloying designer perfume had embedded itself in the curtains and carpet, like a chemical signature of occupation. Deborah stood beside me on her cane, her jaw set with the same determination she had shown on the witness stand. "Start with the vanity," she said. "Every time I look at that mirror, I see her practicing my signature." I pried the back panel free and found what I expected. A high-sensitivity recording device, no larger than a matchbox, adhered to the underside with industrial tape. She had been listening to our conversations for months. Beneath a loose floorboard near the closet, I found a spare key to our safe deposit box. She had been one visit away from cleaning out our last physical repository. We spent the day purging, Designer clothes went to the women's shelter. Business files were boxed for Catherine's records. Deborah found hidden credit card statements behind the closet shelf. More threads in a web. So systematic, it read like a project management timeline. By sunset, the room was bare. The following weekend, we painted the walls a warm cream that caught the afternoon light through windows opened for the first time in months. Each roller stroke transformed the space from a monument to narcissism into a blank canvas for whatever came next. 3 weeks later, a yellow envelope arrived from Essex County Correctional. 12 pages of prison stationery filled with manufactured remorse and calculated demands. She wanted an appeal. She invoked childhood pet names. Tucked inside was a pre-written forgiveness statement for us to sign and submit to the parole board. Still trying to manage us from a 6x9 cell, I fed the 12 pages into my industrial shredder without showing Deborah. 8 seconds of mechanical noise. Then silence. The most eloquent response I could offer. The financial recovery came in stages. Catherine worked with federal asset forfeiture to trace and reclaim what could be recovered. The penthouse was seized and sold. The Tesla auctioned. The offshore accounts in the Caymans frozen and returned. By December, Catherine called with a final figure. 85%, Russell. 430,000 recovered. It is not a miracle, Catherine, I replied. It is a salvage operation. We pulled what we could from the wreck. Derek Merritt received 12 years federal for his cooperation. Long enough to reconsider every decision that led him to a cell. Short enough to confirm that the system rewards those who turn on their co-conspirators before the hull goes under. On the first Saturday of December, Deborah led me into the newly painted room with a look I had not seen in years. Against the far wall, she had set up a drafting table with architectural sketches spread across its surface. The Kane Maritime Youth Foundation, she said. A program to teach boat building to at-risk teenagers. Woodworking. Navigation. The things you taught Cassandra before she decided ships were too slow and money was faster. The building she had selected was the same waterfront property on Rocky Neck that Cassandra had been trying to purchase for a satellite office before the arrest. Poetic, I said. Structural. Deborah corrected with a smile that reached her eyes for the first time since the ventilator was removed. But she had one more surprise. She took me to my workshop and pointed to a wooden chest I had built 30 years ago. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a collection of antique maritime charts dating back to the 18th century. She had been quietly acquiring them for decades, hiding them in the one place Cassandra never entered because sawdust was beneath her. These are worth $180,000, Russell. She never knew they existed because she never valued what you built in this room. The irony was perfect. The one space Cassandra dismissed as worthless contained the one asset she could never reach. Thanksgiving arrived with quiet dignity. No performative centerpieces. No undercurrent of transaction disguised as family. Edgar came with cider. Nurse Callahan brought pie. Catherine shed her attorney armor and laughed at old boatyard stories. We sat around the table, surrounded by faces that shared none of our blood, but had earned their place with loyalty that asked nothing in return. Family is not always the vessel you are born aboard. Sometimes it is the one you build after the first one sinks. New Year's Eve came cold and clear. Deborah and I sat on the back deck wrapped in wool blankets, watching the last light fade over Gloucester Harbor. At 11:53, my phone buzzed one final time. Essex County Correctional. I showed it to Deborah. She did not glance at the screen. There is no one here to pick up anymore, she said. Let it ring out into the cold. I deleted the notification, opened the settings, and permanently deactivated the number. The screen went dark. The last digital tether severed. At midnight, stray fireworks blossomed over the harbor. I poured 2 glasses of sparkling cider, and we touched them together. The hull is sound, Deb, I said. The hull is sound, she agreed, and the tide moved on without us. Looking back at this story, I see my greatest failure was not missing the forged signatures or the drained accounts. It was not failing to notice the firmware patch on my wife's vehicle, or the recording devices hidden beneath my own furniture. My greatest failure was simpler and more human than any of that. I refused to inspect the character of someone I loved because I was afraid of what the survey would reveal. I spent 4 decades examining the integrity of vessels built by other men. I could find a hairline fracture in a steel weld from across a workshop. I could hear the difference between sound timber and punky wood by tapping it with my knuckle. I trained my hands and my eyes to detect the invisible weaknesses that precede catastrophic failure. But I never once turned those tools on my own daughter. I never once asked whether the structure of her character could bear the weight of the values I thought I had built into her from birth. That was not love. That was cowardice, dressed in a father's clothing. I believe now that God allows certain storms not to destroy us, but to reveal what was already rotting beneath the surface. The collapse of my family was not the punishment. The punishment was the years of blindness that preceded it. The years I chose comfort over truth. The years I wrote checks instead of asking questions. The years I mistook silence for peace and generosity for good parenting. If you are listening to this and you recognize something in my story, if there is a person in your life whose behavior you have been explaining away, whose demands you have been funding without accountability, whose coldness you have been interpreting as independence rather than disconnection, I am asking you to do what I did not do until it was almost too late. Inspect. Not with suspicion, not with paranoia, but with the honest, clear-eyed willingness to see what is actually there, rather than what you hope is there. Trust must be audited the same way finances are audited. Love without accountability is not love. It is a blank check written to someone who may never have earned it. And when the warning signs appear, and they always appear, do not patch them with money or silence or the desperate belief that blood guarantees loyalty. Document them, address them, face them with the same courage you would bring to any other structural failure in your life. Many people have called what I did revenge. They say I destroyed my daughter's life. But if I am honest with myself and with you, what I did was never about punishment. It was about protection. It was the moment I stopped being a naive father and started being a responsible one. It was the moment I chose the safety of my wife over the comfort of my denial. Still, I carry the weight of it. No father dreams of standing in a courtroom watching his child be sentenced. No man builds a nursery and imagines that the infant sleeping inside it will one day try to kill her own mother for an insurance payout. I do not celebrate what happened. I grieve it. But I grieve it from a place of solid ground rather than from the bottom of a sinking vessel. I believe that God did not cause this storm, but I believe He steadied my hands while I navigated through it. I believe He placed Edgar in my path with $25,000 and a voice that cut through my self-pity like a saw through rotten wood. I believe He kept Deborah's heart beating on that operating table long enough for the truth to come to light. Faith did not remove the waves. It gave me the keel depth to ride them without capsizing. Boundaries are not cruelty. They are structure. They are the frames and fastenings that keep a vessel intact when the sea tries to pull it apart. Setting a boundary with your own child is not an act of hate. It is an act of architectural necessity. You cannot save a ship by allowing the rot to spread unchecked simply because the rot carries your name. And forgiveness. People ask me about forgiveness. Whether I have found it, whether I offer it. I will say this. Forgiveness is not a dock you arrive at once and tie up forever. It is a tide. It comes in and it goes out. Some mornings I wake up and feel something close to peace about the daughter I lost. Other mornings I find the anger waiting for me like a cold engine that needs to be warmed before it will turn over. I do not force either feeling. I let the tide do what tides do. I trust that the water level will settle eventually into something I can live beside without drowning. This spring, the Kane Maritime Youth Foundation will open its doors on Rocky Neck. 16 at-risk teenagers from the North Shore will learn to read the grain of white oak and bend a plank over steam. They will learn that building something with your hands is not a lesser path than building something with code. They will learn that integrity is not a word you put on a website. It is the quality of the joint you make when no one is watching. Deborah and I sit on our back deck most mornings now, watching the harbor come alive with the slow procession of lobster boats and research vessels heading out for the day. The air smells like salt and diesel and the cedar shavings from my workshop. It smells like home. It smells like the future. If this story touched something in you today, I would be grateful if you shared your thoughts below. What would you have done in my place? Where would you have drawn the line? Your perspective matters to me more than you might realize. And if you have not already, consider subscribing so you do not miss the stories that come next. Each one carries a lesson I wish someone had told me before the storm hit. A gentle note. While inspired by real themes of financial exploitation and family betrayal, certain elements of this story have been dramatized for narrative depth. The message is what I hope stays with you. The hull is sound now. The water is calm. And the view from the bow, with Deborah beside me and the spring sun warming the deck, has never been clearer. We are not the people we were before the storm. We are better. We are lighter. And we are finally, after everything, pointed toward open water.